My name is Mike Hogeterp, and I'm the director of the Christian Reform Center for Public Dialogue, which is a government relations and social justice advocacy group of the Christian Reformed Churches in Canada. I sit on the advocacy working group for the Love of Creation, which is a national initiative that brings together faith bodies and faith-based organizations here in Canada for education, reflection, action, and advocacy for climate justice. I'm really happy to welcome each one of you, indeed as relatives, here this evening. So to start off this evening's discussions in a good way, I'd like to acknowledge that each of us are coming together from the lands of Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. We're grateful to meet and learn together across these beautiful territories that are now called, in the colonial language, Canada. I myself am joining you today from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. I honor Algonquin stewards of this land from time immemorial. And I particularly want to honor Grandfather William Kamanda's vision that Akikojuan, the sacred islands in the Kitchissippi just below our present-day Parliament Hill, he called that a place for peace and reconciliation and a gathering of the nations. That's a sacred testimony from Elder Kamanda. I also honor what I've received as an Algonquin testimony on relatedness, that people are related to everyone and every being, plant, soil, rock, and water in the watersheds in which we live. So I honor my human and non-human relatives in the watershed of this place, Kitchissippi, the river that today is called Ottawa. And I'm particularly thankful for the gift of life that the Kitchissippi's beautiful waters provide every day. As we reflect on this intersection of climate justice and Indigenous rights, our relatedness and responsibilities to all human and non-human relatives that surround us is a critical thing to remember. So friends, everyone is welcome here, and we're all relatives. So if you wish, using the chat function, I encourage you to add to our land acknowledgement by just introducing yourself and the place that you're joining from. With gratitude, please go ahead and do that. So as you know, friends, we're into an election season. And this is the season, also the season of Creation and Climate Action Month. This evening's event is the second in a three-part series for the Love of Creation climate advocacy webinars. In February, we launched our Faith in Action campaign to mobilize people across Canada to reduce household green gas emissions and to demonstrate support for increased federal climate action. Specifically, we're calling on the Government of Canada to, one, increase our national emissions reductions target and invest in a just transition to a fair, inclusive, and green economy. Implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including the critical right of free, prior, and informed consent. Commit equal support for climate change adaptation and mitigation measures in the Global South. So each of the three webinars in this series will focus on one of these calls to action, highlighting progress made over the course of this year, and then identifying next steps. So our hope through these conversations in webinars is that you'll feel encouraged and equipped to engage in climate justice advocacy, and indeed thinking about it while you vote. So in this instance, we hope you'll keep these issues in mind as you determine, again, how you vote, and then beyond that, as you remain active citizens and continue to be part of a dialogue and action that's critical for climate justice. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening, Bishop Susan Johnson. Thank you, Bishop Susan, for agreeing to moderate this evening. Just a brief intro. Reverend Susan Johnson has served as National Bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Canada since 2007. She lives on Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Now, those of you who follow Bishop Susan on social media will have seen her and heard her singing hymns and bringing a bit of bright spirit during our shared COVID challenges. Now, beyond being a great singer and what we all agree is an ecumeniac, which is a phrase we were throwing around earlier, her passions for ministry include justice, yes, ecumenism, and spiritual renewal. Bishop Susan was also a vital participant in an ecumenical climate justice tour a few years back and has been deeply enriched by work with partners within Canada and around the world. So without further ado, thanks, Bishop Susan, and welcome. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mike. I appreciate that. And it's an honor to be here with you this evening. I'd invite you all to join with me in prayer or take a moment of silence as we invite the Spirit into this holy space. God of creation, everything that we have has come and been formed by you. The land, the water, the air, the animals, the birds, the plants, and all peoples have been formed by you and called to be in relationship with you and with one another. We confess to you the ways that we have not lived out these responsibilities. We have not cared for this earth, the good gift which you have given us. We have not cared for our fellow peoples, and we confess to you the way that Indigenous peoples have been mistreated throughout centuries. These days, we remember those children who have been found in unmarked graves at residential schools. We remember the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Turtle Island. We remember the ways that treaty rights have been violated and that Indigenous communities have been marginalized. We pray for mercy. We ask for healing and for a restoration of relationships with the land, with Indigenous peoples, and with each other. We invite you now to come into the space to be with us as we listen and learn and ponder anew. Take what we learned tonight and move us to be active and responsible in our communities and thoughtful as we vote in this next federal election. All these things we pray in the Creator's name. Amen. It's a real honor for me to moderate this session tonight. And I would like to begin with introducing our guest speakers and panelists. I'll begin with introducing Sheryl Lightfoot. Sheryl is Anishinaabe, a citizen of the Lake Superior Band of Ojibwe. She's the North American representative to the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Canada Research Chair in Global Indigenous Rights and Politics, and Associate Professor in Political Science, the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs and Indigenous Studies. She is also Senior Advisor to the President on Indigenous Affairs and is leading the implementation of the 2020 Indigenous Strategic Plan across UBC. As one of the world's experts in global Indigenous politics, Sheryl's research specializes in complex questions of Indigenous people's rights and how those rights are being claimed and negotiated. Her work explores both practical and theoretical aspects of implementation of Indigenous rights globally, as well as in domestic contexts. She is the author of Global Indigenous Politics, A Subtle Revolution, as well as numerous journal articles and book chapters. She holds a PhD in political science from the University of Minnesota, as well as a master's degree from the Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs, University of Minnesota. Prior to her academic career, she had 15 years volunteer and contract experience with a number of American Indian tribes and community-based organizations in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, including 9 years as chair of the board of the American Indian Policy Center, a research and advocacy group. As member of the UN Expert Mechanism, Sheryl provides the Human Rights Council with expertise and advice on the rights of Indigenous peoples. The mechanism also assists member states in achieving the goals of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. She is the first Indigenous woman from Canada to be appointed to this prestigious position. I also want to introduce to you our other speaker, Jennifer Preston. And Jennifer is the Indigenous Rights Coordinator for Canadian Friends Service Committee, the justice arm of the Quakers. Jennifer received her master's degree from the University of Guelph and was a lecturer in Canadian Studies at the University of Waterloo. Jennifer participated in the UN working groups that developed the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and was involved in the intensive lobbying efforts to ensure the adoption of the declaration in both Geneva and New York. Her work now focuses on implementation. She works closely with Indigenous peoples representatives and state representatives, as well as human rights organizations in various regions of the world, including at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. She is a co-editor of and contributor to Realizing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Triumph, Hope, and Action. For 10 years, she wrote the Annual Review of Canada for the Indigenous World, published by the International Working Group on Indigenous Affairs. Jennifer represented CFSC at the Supreme Court of Canada in the landmark Chilcotin Nation case. Jennifer represents CFSC in and coordinated the Coalition for the Human Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Both have been involved in Indigenous rights work for decades, including public education and outreach. Sheryl and Jennifer are proud to have launched the Global Indigenous Rights Research Network earlier this year. I'm sure you can tell that we are in for a real treat tonight. And so I'm going to call on Jennifer to speak first.
Great. Thank you so much, Bishop Susan, for that introduction. And thanks also to Mike for his introduction as well. And also thanks to all of those who are involved in planning this webinar series for the love of creation. And I know that we are the second in a three-part series. So I wanted to begin by acknowledging I'm a settler and I'm coming to you today from Southwestern Ontario, traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory, and is what is now called Guelph, Ontario. I was born in Lenene Lape territory in what's now the United States. And it is a real pleasure for me to be here tonight with my friend and colleague, Sheryl Lightfoot. So this webinar series, I know, has been on mainly around climate change and climate work, climate justice work. And clearly climate justice work has many intersections with Indigenous rights work, which is why tonight's evening is centered on Indigenous people's human rights, which is, of course, the area of expertise for both Sheryl and myself. And I would just start by saying that it is understood by international experts and by the UN doing the work on climate change that Indigenous peoples globally are already the most affected by the adverse effects of climate change and are facing the most severe impacts. And that Indigenous peoples and Indigenous knowledge have much to offer in the discussion around healing from the current climate crisis. And I would just say there was a report put out from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights based in Geneva towards the global work that's being done at the UN level around climate change, commenting on how disproportionately vulnerable peoples are in the effects of climate change, including, of course, Indigenous peoples, that being one of the reasons why it is so important to be looking at understanding and respecting Indigenous people's rights in the discussions around climate justice as well. Now, tonight, Sheryl and I are going to be speaking about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and also about the current legislation that has come into force in Canada on implementing the declaration. as well as on how people of faith can engage in advocacy around this. And we do have a few slides for you to share. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and run the slides. And we're going to hope that that is going to work. And we're going to go here. So just to begin on the declaration itself, and some of you may already have heard this in or heard me talk about it, but just very briefly, because we don't have time to go into all of the details of the history, but just very briefly, the UN Declaration itself spent more than 20 years in negotiations in Geneva at the UN, and that makes it the most discussed instrument in the history of the United Nations. And I would say that one of the reasons, or the main reason for that, was the role of Indigenous peoples representatives. At a certain point in the second working group, it was decided essentially to change the rules of the UN, and so that Indigenous peoples were part of the consensus, because the UN does its work mainly by consensus. So the consensus became not just consensus of nation states, it became consensus of all of the representatives, Indigenous peoples representatives and member states representatives. And that really changed the whole functioning of the development of the declaration itself. So it is why it took so long. It is also why it is known as a compromise instrument. I would say that Indigenous delegates didn't get everything they were looking for, nor did member states. So that is important to know. And I would say that if you are interested, and it is a very, very fascinating story about the whole journey that this work took in the 20 plus years, and the journey that Indigenous leaders took the global human rights community on. And if you're interested in that, as it was in our bios, Sheryl and I have both published on the history of the Declaration, and that really does help sort of unpack all of the years of that work. So the amended version of the Declaration was adopted in 2007. The UN in Geneva at the Human Rights Council had adopted it, the Human Rights Council version, in 2006. There was a lot of political shenanigans, which I do not have time to describe, but the upshot of that was in September of 2007, we just had the 14th anniversary. The Declaration was adopted by the General Assembly. And here's a picture, that iconic picture of the day of the vote. This is in the General Assembly Hall. And what you're seeing there is the President of the General Assembly looking up at the screens on either side of her, because quite honestly, it was not certain exactly how this was going to all come down until the last minute. There was a lot of pressure being put on a lot of states to go against this. And so at the end of the day, we had 144 states in favor of the Declaration and 4 against. And of course, the 4 against, the infamous 4, are Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand. All 4 had soon reversed those positions. Canada reversed its position formally in 2010. And later, the Trudeau government campaigned in 2015 on the UN Declaration, support for the Declaration. And in 2016, indeed attended the UN to further endorse the Declaration without any qualification. So it's important to know that the Declaration was never about creating new rights. The Declaration affirms inherent rights of Indigenous peoples, and that means pre-existing rights. Indigenous peoples have these rights because they are Indigenous peoples. And that was very important. It also was building on existing international human rights law, which was then articulated in a manner to reflect the ongoing challenges that Indigenous peoples continue to face around the globe. And I'll just say there, because I know, Mike talked about the commitments for the love of creation for the year, that all the pieces of work, and around this commitment to FPIC, or free, prior, and informed consent. So it's important to know the UN Declaration did not create FPIC. That's not where it originated from. Free, prior, and informed consent comes down directly from the right of self-determination. The right of self-determination is a common Article 1 in the two major UN covenants, both of which Canada ratified in 1977, which means that since 1977, Canada has had a legal obligation to those covenants and a legal obligation to uphold the right of self-determination. That's where FPIC comes from. So whenever you hear any particularly fear-mongering around implementing the declaration, around things like, oh, but we don't know about FPIC, remember, this is not where it comes from. And this is not where Canada's obligation to respect it comes from. So it doesn't, the declaration does not create new rights. That's really important. In the work to develop the declaration, it was widely known throughout the international human rights system that globally Indigenous peoples continued to be the most marginalized and continued to have their human rights most often affected. And often, globally, this was about dispossessing Indigenous peoples from their lands and territories in the name of resource extraction or development. And so that was a huge piece of why the declaration came to be, why that work happened by the UN, and why Indigenous representatives invested so many years and so much work into achieving this declaration. And I would say that Quakers were involved in the declaration since this work began in Geneva in the mid-1970s. And it has been the bulk of my work over the past 20 years. And so that's sort of just giving you a little bit of a background to that work and to the history of the declaration itself, taking you up to the adoption of it by the UN already 14 years ago. Now, some of you may recognize the cover of this booklet because this is the booklet copy of the declaration that the Coalition for the Human Rights of Indigenous Peoples put out shortly after the declaration was adopted. So we decided to produce a booklet version, a pocket-sized version, so it'd be easy for people to have the declaration with them. And to date, we have distributed well over 500,000 copies of the booklet. And I did once get a call from the Canadian Human Rights Commission, and she said, Jennifer, this is the best known human rights instrument in this country, and it's because of those booklets. So I would say, you know, when you make it accessible, and that helps for people to be able to engage with it. So the Coalition for the Human Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and you can see the web address for the coalition there on the screen. The coalition has been working together informally since before the adoption. We came together during the development of the declaration so that we could have actors from Canada working jointly on the success of the declaration. And we've stayed together ever since. It brings together mainly Indigenous organizations, as well as some Indigenous individuals who are very active on the national scene, people like Ellen Gabriel and Chief Wilton Littlechild, as well as organizations, including the Assembly of First Nations, the Grand Council of the Crees, the Cree Nation government. And Kairos has also been part of the coalition. So you may have seen coalition materials distributed by Kairos over the years. And Sheryl and I are both active in the coalition now in working towards implementation of the declaration. The coalition was quite active in the pushing for federal legislation, and things that we have done over the years include different educational resources, many of which are housed easily to find on that website. So go and take a tour, I urge you. We've also had symposiums, as well as engaging with public officials, and always noting the anniversary. This year we released a statement, I guess, what's the date? On Monday, we released a statement for the anniversary this year of the 14th year since the declaration has been adopted. So now I just want to speak really briefly to the work of legislation. And I know that many of you were engaged when Romeo Saganash had his private members bill before Parliament. I know that there was a tremendous support from faith bodies for Romeo's bill C-262. And so this is not a story I need to tell you. I'm sure you're familiar with. He introduced it in 2016, and it got all the way through, which is very unusual for a private member's bill, and was sadly filibustered, shockingly filibustered by a handful of senators so that it did not become law in June of 2019. However, I guess the bright spot coming out of that was that the Liberal government committed that if they were reelected, they would reintroduce legislation. They would introduce legislation that would be built from C-262. So that was really a low point in this work when that bill was denied. And I think that it was a low point in a voice of saying Canada is not ready to do this work. And so I think that was really hard for everyone, Romeo especially, but everyone who had engaged in the declaration all of these years, for it to be 2018, and that's 11 years after the adoption by the UN, and 8 years after Canada endorsed it, for Canada to not figure out how it could make a commitment to implementing it. So I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. But before I go there, I just want to speak very briefly to the Truth and Reconciliation Commissioners. And I think that probably for many of you and for many of your faith houses and organizations, you may have come to this work through the work of the TRC. And I can't say enough of how incredibly important their work was on so many levels, but including on the UN Declaration and advancing the UN Declaration, and for people to understand what the UN Declaration was and why it was important. In 2015, the TRC called the UN Declaration the framework for reconciliation. And in their Principles of Reconciliation, which they published before the end of their work, the first principle of reconciliation reads, "The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is the framework for reconciliation at all levels and across all sectors of society." And I'm going to guess that many of you were in Ottawa for the closing events in June of 2015, and the release of the calls to action, of which there are many references to the UN Declaration, but I particularly just wanted to remind you of call to action 43 and 44, where they call on all levels of government in implementing the declaration and in the creation by the federal government of a national action plan. So that really takes us back to the work on legislation. And so they were doing that work even before 262 was tabled, and they were supporting 262. Then Senator Sinclair was actually leading that work in the Senate. And so then we get ourselves to 2020, where Bill C-15 was introduced. And I've taken us from introduction to adoption, just like that. In the interest of time, I will not go through all of the details of C-15, but I just wanted to say that C-15 did, as Mike had mentioned earlier, I think Mike mentioned this earlier, there was a coalition called Faith in the Declaration, coalition of church houses that came together to work on support for C-15, work on federal legislation to implement the declaration. And the Faith in the Declaration also has a website, which is faithinthedeclaration.ca, and that where all of the resources that coalition was working on are housed. That website is still live. And so that I would also send you there. And it was something that we all had a big commitment to. So I can say that smile on Senator Christmas's face is was totally shared by so many of us when the Senate, in fact, managed to do their job and get this bill done. That was a big deal, and it was a big, big win for Indigenous peoples and their allies when royal assent came down on June 21st of this year for the Declaration Implementation Law. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to be handing the floor, as it were, the screen to Sheryl, and we are going to continue with this PowerPoint presentation. And Sheryl, you can just give me a cue when you're ready for me to advance slides as we go along.
Fantastic, Jennifer, and thanks so much for the handoff and the beautiful summary on getting us from essentially 1977, where the UN declaration work began, right up until 2021 with the Senate finally passing Bill C-15. Well done. That's 30 plus years of history in just a few minutes. So thank you for that. And I also want to thank Bishop Johnson for the very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be joining you this evening to have this very important conversation. And I also deeply appreciate the connection to climate work and climate justice, as this is increasingly a top issue for Indigenous peoples around the world. Arctic, Amazon, desert conditions, no matter where Indigenous peoples live, they seem to be on the front lines of climate change and feeling the impacts most deeply. I'm pleased to join you this evening from my home office on the campus of the University of British Columbia, which is better known in Indigenous circles as the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And I want to pay my respects and acknowledge their territory, and also the important work that they do in partnership with us here at the University of British Columbia. They are incredibly strong supporters of Indigenous initiatives and programming, and I always want to express my gratitude to them for that. And I think it's important also to mention that being from British Columbia right now and living here, we did slide in a piece of provincial legislation to implement the UN declaration that was introduced, this is pre-pandemic times now, it feels like a long time ago, introduced here in the provincial legislature in November 2019. So that legislation slid in between the dismal results of Romeo Saganash's Bill 262 and the introduction of Bill C-15. So British Columbia came in doing very similar legislation on the provincial level, calling for very similar things. And so it has the distinction of being the first jurisdiction, albeit a subnational jurisdiction on the provincial level in the English-speaking world, of passing UN declaration implementation. So I think the grand experiments are proceeding out west here. And so one of the key features of all of these pieces of legislation is the Indigenous presence and the Indigenous voice in developing the legislation, negotiating the legislation, and hopefully also a very strong voice in implementing the legislation through the action plans. And so those are key features common through 262, the British Columbia legislation, and now the federal legislation, what we called B16, but is now the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. Now, the picture that you see on the screen in front of you is Minister David Lametti, our Attorney General and Justice Minister. He took the time during the conversations about C-15 to meet with many Indigenous stakeholders, but also with faith leaders. So what you're seeing here is a picture of him meeting with faith leaders across the country to discuss the bill during its process. Jennifer, go ahead and advance the slide for us. Thank you. And what we're showing here, now one of the differences, there aren't many differences in substance between Bill C-15, our UN Declaration Act, and the British Columbia legislation and Romeo Saganash's 262. One of the big distinctions and additions, and really, I think one of the most important features to recognize in the final piece of federal legislation is the preamble. The previous bills did not contain preambular paragraphs. The current legislation does. And I really encourage you, when you have a moment, to read all of the preambular paragraphs. There's a lot of important work that's going on in those preambular paragraphs that affirms and reinforces some of the actionable areas of the declaration and really reinforces the human rights principles that are operational in the legislation. And we want to draw your attention in particular to the 15th preambular paragraph, which is up on the screen. And this paragraph draws the connection very clearly between Indigenous peoples' human rights, sustainable development, and growing concerns related to climate change. And so this legislation does bring that forward in a very concrete, distinctive, and clear way. Go ahead and advance the slide one more time, Jennifer. So key elements in the operational paragraphs of the legislation, the substantive paragraphs, and also key elements that I think are very important that we all recognize in all of these pieces of legislation. And I think it's the point number one is really important in terms of how we action Indigenous people's rights in day-to-day lives. And one of the key changes, which began way back in the 1970s when Indigenous peoples inserted themselves into the process that would eventually become the UN Declaration, is the inclusion, the co-development of National Action Plan and the legislation itself with Indigenous peoples. And I think that's a fundamental shift in how this country, Canada, has traditionally done business. In the old model, the government makes all of the decisions and then does a quick consultation with Indigenous peoples if it feels they're impacted. The sea change that we're seeing and have been seeing for a number of decades now is stronger co-development operations, that Indigenous people and state parties and other stakeholders sit down at the table together and co-develop and co-create these instruments. So one of the key elements of the legislation is that the National Action Plan, the implementation plan for the UN Declaration, will also be created with Indigenous peoples moving forward. Secondly, and this is incredibly important from Indigenous perspectives, is that there will be a full review of federal laws and policies in order to assess their alignment and consistency with the UN Declaration. Now, this is striking for a number of audiences in Canada who are sometimes shocked to find out that the existing legal framework in Canada is actually inconsistent with international human rights where Indigenous peoples are concerned. So once they've gotten over that shock and have come to terms with that reality, then it's time that we can all set about doing a full-scale review and revision of those laws and policies in order to make them consistent with this international human rights document. And then thirdly, and this is also present in the BC legislation, there will be annual reporting to Parliament on progress developed, again, co-developed and worked out with Indigenous peoples themselves. Jennifer, please take us to the next slide. So one of the questions that I often am asked is, what can people do in their everyday lives in order to advance human rights in productive and constructive ways? And I can say that often this comes down to taking an initiative or doing an innovation at the most micro level, at the grassroots level. And I want to leave you with a couple examples of work that I'm currently involved in, just to prompt some food for thought. Now, coming down to that micro level, institutionally, UBC, where again, I'm on faculty, we are presently extending our societal obligation to implement the UN Declaration to the university level. And we were the first ones to delve into this space. So it was a bit daunting, and it has been a bit complex as we try to figure out, what does implementing the declaration mean on a university level in a post-secondary context? And after about a year and a half of deep engagement with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous parts of the university and our Indigenous community partners and others, we ended up committing to 8 larger goals and 43 specific action items that chart our path, unique to UBC, about how we can change some processes, procedures, curriculum in order to implement the UN Declaration in this space. Because for what we heard from Indigenous students, Indigenous faculty, Indigenous staff, colonialism is still quite a daily reality at UBC. And one need not look very far to see the premium here that's placed on Eurocentric approaches to research, to teaching, and why so many Indigenous people do not see themselves reflected here in the classroom or the workplace. So the plan is aiming to better integrate Indigenous worldviews, Indigenous legal traditions in the law school, Indigenous governance in the political science and policy school, and then Indigenous social structures throughout our campus curriculum and campus life. One more slide, Jennifer. And as Bishop Johnson mentioned in her introductions, as Jennifer and I are both working together in the very early stages of building an international research partnership that brings together expert researchers into collaborative work with Indigenous and human rights organizations. And the Coalition to Advance the Human Rights of Indigenous Peoples is one of the organizations that we are working with. And this partnership was a brainchild of several of us who came together over a number of years in discussion. And it aims to pool resources across a number of universities and organizations in order to conduct data collection, monitoring, and reporting on implementation progress around the world. And most importantly, get this information into the hands of Indigenous communities, organizations, Indigenous leadership, where it can be utilized and leveraged in different national, regional, and local contexts. And so we are planning to collate and mobilize transnationally now, even beyond Canada, some of the insights gathered in particular local or domestic spaces in order to share good practices and just as important, our learnings, our challenges with one another around the world. And so I'm going to stop there for now, and happy to pick up any of those points and questions later on in the discussion period.
So now we might invite the two of you to have 5 minutes of conversation together, and then we're going to move into small groups where you'll be asked as small groups to come up with one question from your group for Jennifer and for Sheryl. Please go ahead. Go ahead.
Sheryl, I have a question for you. I know that one of the things that we were talking about earlier today was the fact that, of course, we have a federal election on our doorstep. And I'm just wondering if you want to comment on, are you surprised by the lack of attention being paid to Indigenous people's rights issues in this federal election?
Oh, thank you, Jennifer. That's actually a question coming into my email inbox probably once an hour these days. So I'm happy to speak to that. I am surprised, and the biggest reason for my surprise is the revelations that came beginning in the end of May, just after the long weekend. And of course, the revelations of unmarked graves is not news. There was an entire volume on it in the TRC's report that came out in 2015. So for those who have been following that closely, this should not have been a shock. However, it seemed to be a shock to a great sector of the population of this country, and it certainly shocked quite a bit of the world. And then that was followed by further revelations over the summer. It's very disappointing to me, and actually very painfully so, as the descendant, several generations descendant of residential school survivors, that this could be so easily brushed off to the side and not a major election issue so soon afterwards. That's actually an incredibly painful point. I don't quite know what to make of that, and I'm trying to deal with that on an intellectual level and also on an emotional level. But what I do see that is still gives me some degree of hope is that when asked direct questions in debates, there is a conversation about the future of reconciliation in this country. I wish it was a bit more on the front burner than the side burner or the back burner. So perhaps it's a return to a denial frame in some sectors. I'm not really sure. I think for me personally, the emotion of it is getting in the way of calm, clear-headed reason at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate that question. And let me ask one to you, Jennifer, and that is, I know the Quakers, and like you mentioned, I've done my own historical work on the Declaration, and just as a bit of biographical note, when I was a child, I was in the city of Minneapolis, which was the heyday of the American Indian movement, and some of the early figures that played into the very early days of the UN Declaration. So even though I didn't realize it as a small child, I was there in some of the early stage development of the movement. And I know that the Quakers were one of the faith organizations that have been involved in declaration work for so many years. And why has that been important for Quakers?
I think it's been important to Quakers, following out of our testimonies, both testimonies around peace, but also testimonies around integrity and justice. And that for Quakers, it was really important for those of you who know the history of Quakers ended up in the New World because they needed to not be in England anymore because of religious persecution. However, arriving in the New World meant they were displacing other people. So I think that throughout the entire history of Quaker history in North America, there's been an awareness and an engagement with Indigenous justice work. And that came into the work around the UN Declaration. And I also think that it really is very central to the idea of, as a historic peace church, we can't be at peace without justice. We all know that Indigenous peoples are not yet living with justice. So as part of our faith, we need to be engaging with the justice for Indigenous peoples.
Thank you both so very much. You've given us a lot of material to think about. I'm going to invite us then to go into 7 small groups and to reflect on what you've heard thus far. And your task as a group is to come up with one question. So when we come back, we'll hopefully get a chance to hear all 7 questions and answers. So enjoy your time in small groups. Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had good conversations in your small groups. And we're going to go group by group and ask for what your question is. I hope you've designated someone to be the spokesperson with your question. And if you want to address it specifically to either Sheryl or Jennifer, please say so when you ask the question. And so when I call on, for example, in a minute, group 1, just whoever is speaking for group 1, unmute yourself and just go ahead. So let's do that. Group 1, let's hear your question. Do we have anyone from group 1 with a question?
We had a spokesperson. It was a man. I don't know what I can't, he said he wrote it in the chat. He wrote it.
But it's not there. I'm Eric. So I'll try to do it. So our question is, what are some of the ideas and actions that Indigenous people can bring and are bringing to address sustainable development and climate change now?
Jennifer or Sheryl?
I can start if you want. So I think that you mean in general. And I think that one of the things that we have seen in Canada and also in other areas of the globe, of course, is, as Sheryl mentioned, Indigenous communities being on the front lines of climate action. And I think that one of the things that we see in Indigenous communities themselves is that fighting for that space. But also I think that it's so multi-layered between, that's a huge question really, because, in terms of the context, do you mean politically? Is it in terms of space? I think that one of the things about the space is when we're looking at Indigenous people's human rights and Indigenous people's rights to lands being so denied for so long, then when we're looking at sustainable development, I can give you one really good concrete example is on Haida Gwaii, which people may know is at the northwestern part of Canada, is the Haida Gwaii and the land of the Haida people. They have their own developed themselves. I don't know if it's what it's exactly called, but their governance around sustainable development and around how the land that is their territory will be developed. And they developed that, and they have now worked with the province of BC, as well as with Canada, to get agreement for respect for what their governance says that they as Haida people, how their land can be affected. And I think that, some of you may know that Haida Gwaii, one of the big issues there has been logging, and about logging companies. And this obviously is a big issue in the province of British Columbia, but in other parts of the country as well, where logging companies get permits from the province, and Indigenous voices have very little control over that whole arrangement. So in Haida Gwaii, they've developed this, and they have gotten now the agreement with the feds and with the province about the respect for their jurisdiction, the respect for their governance, and the respect for how they are saying how sustainable development will happen in their territory. So that's a sea shift from what was previously happening in terms of logging in their territory. So I think that's a really concrete on the ground where a nation is involved in sustainable development and addressing climate change. And I would say, because I have to give a shout out to Hannah Edenshaw, who's a young Haida woman who is one of the young adults who is suing the government of Canada on the issue of climate change with I think there's a dozen of them, young adults that are suing the government on that. And Hannah is a young Haida woman who's deeply engaged in sustainable development and climate change and has been to the UN as well, advocating for the rights of the Haida and how the rights of the Haida are so intricately connected to climate action.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Jennifer. And if I could just bring two more concrete examples from British Columbia, but also reaching over to my friends and colleagues in Australia. One involves one of the biggest problems that we've seen in the last few years, wildfires, both in British Columbia, stretching down, of course, into Washington and Oregon last year, and the horrific wildfires that were in Australia just about a year and a half ago that burned so much of the forest territory and involved tremendous amounts of wildlife lost. In all of these cases, the BC interior, stretching down into Washington, Oregon, and also in Australia, there are millennia old Indigenous practices of controlled burning, forest management, and well-known Indigenous ways of sustainably maintaining those lands, which have all been cast aside since the settlers arrived in favor of European styles of land management. And so I hear often, both in Australian Aboriginal circles and here in the western part of North America, the need to better integrate those Indigenous knowledges into wildfire management, forestry management, and so on. Another case that we can think about is mining, and there are the mining laws in British Columbia come straight out of the 19th century. Just to give you a reality check. So anyone who wants to stake a claim can go file a claim, and it doesn't matter at current legal practice whose Indigenous territory is involved. It's a matter of registering the claim and going ahead and mining. There are a number of Indigenous nations in BC who are pushing back against this one. They want new legislation. They want Indigenous jurisdiction and territories recognized, not because they don't want mining. And I'm thinking of Tahltan Nation in the northern part of BC. They are very open to mining companies, and they work with some mining companies. What they want is to be able to say how that mining is operated, what happens to the waste, how it's going to be managed. They want to say in that because they want to make sure that their lands and territories are not just devastated by the mining practices. So they're asking to be at the table as equals and have all of those conversations and bring their own knowledges to the table on how to do responsible mining. So just a couple off the top of my head from my sphere of day-to-day interactions.
Thanks.
Great question.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and hear from group two.
I think we're group two.
Okay.
I'm not sure. So our question is, which follows a bit on the tails of the previous question. How do we establish a relationship with the First Nations so that we ask them to take leadership in showing us how to care for the land? And as an example, I live in British Columbia on the coast in a biosphere. And I'm sure most people in my biosphere don't even know that they are part of it. And I have no idea whether the First Nations are part of that biosphere or looking after it. So how do we invite the First Nations people in our area to take the initiative, to take leadership in showing us how to care for the land?
Thank you, Brenda.
You're welcome.
Jennifer or Sheryl?
Well, that's an interesting question. Maybe it depends, I guess, on where you are. Are you in relationship with your with local Indigenous communities? If where you live, are there, like, I know in many places in the country, Indigenous communities are close to non-Indigenous communities, and in some places the country they are not. So are you in relationship with your neighbors, your Indigenous neighbors? If you are not, I guess then I would start by saying, find a way to get in relationship with your Indigenous neighbors. If you are in relationship with them, then I would say, ask them that question, and say, and maybe as an ally, one of the ways to ask that question is to say, how can we support you in this work? So that you're sure that as an ally, you are taking your lead from your Indigenous neighbor community, and that Indigenous peoples are the ones who are answering those questions, but that you can say, we would like to be good allies. How can we support you in your work for us to do that?
Thank you. Let's go on to group 3. Anyone from group 3 ready to speak? How about 4?
We were group 3. I forget who wrote down the question. So does the person there recognize me?
I hadn't realized that we were group 3. I thought we were
I think we were
4. But if we're group 3, then I will go ahead with our question. How can the Declaration and a rights perspective help us to do good consultation, given the multiplicity of First Nations and representatives of these nations to be consulted?
Yeah, excellent question. I mean, isn't that a $1 million question? How do you do something in cooperation when you may have probably 70 different Indigenous nations? I'm not talking about band councils, I'm talking about nations in this country. Do you have a table that has representatives of all of those together when you're having a federal discussion? And I would say that that could be clunky. Maybe that's what you have to do. But I would also say that one example that we can point to where this has happened in the past and happened successfully was when Canada was repatriating the Constitution. And the way that happened was regional work. So there was representatives of different Indigenous regions or different regions of Canada, different Indigenous representatives, and they were working inside that region to make sure that all communities, all Indigenous communities were being involved in that conversation. And then those regional voices were coming back to another table. So that's an example of how it's worked. You see that in Canada already with the Indigenous political makeup in this country, that we have regional branches for Indigenous political organizations, so that they can do political governance in that manner, and other types of political alliances. So it's a big job, but it certainly isn't undoable.
Yeah, I guess from my perspective, I just reverse the challenge. How do non-Indigenous people make decisions and consult with different municipalities? Yeah, you do it the same way. You gather people together, you have community meetings, you have conversations, you make a presentation, you gather inputs, and you do it one community at a time, generally. And it works the same way in Indigenous spaces. And actually, Canadian society is well equipped to do this. We're deeply consultative, democratic. We know how to do it. We know what to do. We know what's right. And we know when people feel they haven't been properly engaged or consulted, they raise their voices. So this is all actually very familiar if we just reverse the sights and say, how do we all normally do this in political life? It's often messy and it's often clunky, but we know we have to do it because it's the right thing to do.
Thank you very much. Let's hear the remaining questions. We're running close to the end of our time, and maybe there's some overlap and they can be grouped together. So let's hear the question from group 4, please.
Hi, I think I'm from group 4. My name is Divi, and thanks, I'm learning a lot so far. So our question is there a specific section or article of the UN Declaration that you would suggest faith groups and student groups on campus, because I'm coming from that demographic, that we begin with when trying to incorporate it into our communities?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Divi. Let's hear the question from group 5.
Hi. Group 5's questions were similar to the ones already identified, which is when you're working out of a broad-based climate network, but it ends up being populated largely by settler folks. How do you, given that the urgency of the climate crisis and then knowing the need to engage with Indigenous peoples and all peoples, in fact, members from racialized communities and that, knowing that relationships take a while, some of them are not strong enough to allow engagement to really happen. And so then the question is, how do we engage so it doesn't become tokenism? How do we do both things at the same time? So it's similar to the other questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Henriette. How about group 6?
Hi, so our question was, how might we as organizations, faith communities, policymakers, and implementers work to quicken the pace to seek justice for Indigenous peoples, holding the tension of relationship building, which is long-term, with or versus the urgency of the climate crisis, which is a very immediate need? Thank you.
Great question. Thank you. And group 7.
We're interested in learning from you what we can do on 2 different levels. On the governmental level, how can we get newly elected MPs to refocus on Indigenous rights, and what specifically should we be advocating for? Is there a specific aspect, a specific portion of UNDRIP that we can quote at them and say, do this? And then the next one, on the grassroots level, it ties in a bit with what Divi said. Can we use the UBC work that's already been done at the university there? Can we use that? Is that document available for sharing? And if not, can you share some main points or lessons learned?
Thank you. Now that's a lot of questions and we only have a few minutes. So let's see how you can do.
Sheryl, would you like me to begin, or would you like to begin?
Oh, go ahead. I'm typing
okay.
into the chat.
So I'm going to try and fly through those. I would say that one of the things that I encourage people when I speak about the Declaration and also when I speak about the TRC is, rather than point you to one article or one part of the Declaration, I always like to say to people, read it. I mean, that's why one of the reasons we made that booklet copy. Read it because it won't take you long, and find yourself. And I say the same thing about the calls to action, because you will. If you read it with that in mind, you will find yourself and you will find the space that it makes sense for you to most engage first. So that's how I would start with that. How to be working with Indigenous peoples and not be, how for settlers to be working with Indigenous peoples without asking Indigenous peoples to be a token representative on a committee. This is a good question, and it's not an easy one. I think that one of the things that is important is that we also, as settlers, need to remember that Indigenous peoples had a lot of work on their plate, and one of the things they don't need to be doing is holding our hand while we're trying to do our own work. So that we don't want to put that on them. At the same time, when there's important work to be done and you are aware that you are a very white looking group of people in the room and you think to yourselves, this is not a very diverse committee. I would say the same thing. Find out what's already happening, right? There's lots of Indigenous organizations that are doing climate work. So, I think that look into some of the major climate organizations. 350.org is founded by an Indigenous man. Look to those organizations, see where Indigenous peoples are already doing major climate work and see maybe you don't have to have one of them on your committee, but maybe what you can be doing is making sure you're bringing that perspective into the discourse that you're having in your committee meetings. How do we quicken the pace and the need for relationships? Delicate balance. I would say we have to do both at the same time. There's a desperate need for relationship building across sectors and to have a greater diversity. And I think that we have been shockingly bad at that for centuries. And we can't overcome that shockingly bad behavior in overnight or in 2 weeks or in 6 months, but we can begin where we are and see how and be super conscious of it, right? I think that one of the things that happened across the certainly North America in the last year after the death of George Floyd was people becoming super aware. And then, as Sheryl said, when there was the discovery of those graves, all of a sudden we became super aware again. But that was not news. We knew that. We knew that those graves were there. But suddenly we collectively got woke. And that's, I think we have to be aware of all of those pieces. And then, as I said, start where you are, figuring where can I build relationship? And one of the easy things that I say often to people who are looking on how to be an ally and where do I begin, and I have no idea where to begin, is if you're in an urban center, go find a friendship center. That's part of the mandates of friendship centers. Go find a friendship center, show up and and see what happens, start where you are. And I would say what to advocate for. I think that we have to advocate for no matter who forms government, we have to advocate for the attention to stay on this legislation and this commitment to this action plan, as well as, of course, all of the many other things that are often being discussed, whether it's the follow-up to the calls to justice for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, whether it's the continued work from the TRC. All parties have made commitments to the TRC, and that work has not happened, or very little of it has happened. So, and how do you make government accountable? I mean, I think that's a whole nother webinar, but I think that, again, start where you are. And I think that this is my boy Pashu. And now, because we probably have 30 seconds left, I just want to let Sheryl also have an opportunity to leap through all of those questions.
I think you did a fabulous job, Jennifer. So I'm just going to add the UBC Indigenous Strategic Plan. If we were in person, I would hand out each of these little pocket guides. You can find it online. We just launched our new website on Monday, the anniversary date of the UN Declaration, by design, because we've grounded our UBC work in the UN Declaration. And if you go to the new website, which this is just phase 1, there's much more to come in the next 6 to 12 to 18 months. But phase 1, you will find the document itself. You'll find a lengthy document on process, how we got this, and how we did it and why we did what we did and the full rationales for it. You'll find some early stories around the university of how people are actioning the plan. There's all kinds of material there, resources. We've developed toolkits so that a department chair can pick up the toolkit and get from, I don't know where to start, to an actual plan for their own department. And we've laid out a process for them to work on that. So we're very busy people. My team of 3 people, works very hard to produce all of this, and much more to come. So please feel free to use it, adapt it, use it as a thinking tool for work in your own spaces.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all the groups for your excellent questions. And thank you for Jennifer and Sheryl for plowing through those in such record time. Thank you very much. It's now time. I'm going to turn things back to Mike, and he will close things off for us this evening.
Well, thanks very much, Bishop Susan. Appreciate your leadership tonight. And Jennifer and Sheryl, what a rich time together. Thank you so much. Jennifer, it goes without saying, we deeply appreciate your presence tonight and your long service and commitment to Indigenous rights. I think one thing that sticks out to me tonight in what you said was just your very simple statement: find yourself in the declaration and the calls to action. It's going to stick with me. It's super important. Sheryl, grateful that you shared your voice with us tonight, and indeed your leadership and vision for Indigenous rights for many years too. Thanks absolutely for your encouragement to each one of us to start where we are. I think that makes this journey just a little bit easier. When you look at the big specter, it can be kind of intimidating, but all of us can make a difference just where we are. So thanks for that encouragement. And one more expression of gratitude, just beg your indulgence for just a couple more minutes, friends. Thanks to the For the Love of Creation team, particularly Carrie and Beth and so many others for the great organization work for this series. Thank you also to Michael at CPJ for his great behind the scenes tech work tonight. This discussion, I think, sparked some really good questions. So thanks to all of you for your thoughtful engagement. I hope that this time has sparked for you some thinking and action ideas on that relationship between the climate justice and Indigenous rights. So we certainly encourage you, as For the Love of Creation, to carry this learning into your communities and to think about what you've heard tonight, even as you vote on Monday. So please do join the community next week on the 23rd, following the election, for what's a really important follow-up discussion on the need for Canada to reduce emissions and invest in a just transition, the last priority of For the Love of Creation that'll be considered. You're also invited to sign up for the For the Love of Creation newsletter and follow us also on social media. And then join us for a fall symposium, which we're excited about, on Saturday, October 30th. We also encourage you again to vote on September 20, and on September, or in the chat, Carrie's sharing a few things that are some resources that you may find helpful. So without further ado, thank you so much for your participation. Thanks, panelists. Thanks, Bishop Susan, for your wonderful leadership tonight. Really grateful. And with that, we'll call it to a close. Thank you so much, friends.